Bom dia a todos, bom dia a todas. Good morning, Jacqueline. Com muita alegria nós recebemos a professora Jacqueline Liu, da Universidade Nacional de Singapura. Welcome, Jacqueline, professor of the National University of Singapore. É um grande prazer para nós recebê-la nessa conferência de encerramento, de clausura. It's a pleasure to us receive you in your university in this closed conference. Thank you very much to accept our invitation. Thank you. A professora, vou apresentar a professora. A professora Jacqueline Liu é professora associada da National University of Singapore, diretora do Centro de Estudos Jurídicos da Ásia, Center of Asian Legal Studies, professora de Direito Constitucional e Administrativo, cientista jurídica e co-catedrática, ou co-titular, da International Society for Public Law. E é um prazer, como dizia, receber a professora Jacqueline. Estamos bastante honrados com a presença dela, que vai nos abrilhantar, que vai nos presentear com seus conhecimentos e uma dimensão que é pouco conhecida no Brasil, que são os estudos asiáticos. Se quiser traduzir essa parte para ela, Aline, por favor.
Well, Professor Marcio is welcoming Professor Jacqueline and saying that your knowledge is a field that is not very known in Brazil, which is the Asian Studies field.
E para nós, por isso, uma grande contribuição para a evolução dos nossos estudos de liberdade religiosa, de direito. Então, muito obrigado. Quero apresentar também a Aline. A Aline é doutoranda da Faculdade de Direito da USP, em São Paulo. Foi minha mestranda, já é mestre em Direito aqui pela Faculdade de Direito de Ribeirão, Preto. E ela colabora conosco com o serviço de tradução. Então, bem-vindas ambas. E vamos já dar início, passamos a palavra a Jacqueline. The word is yours, Jacqueline.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Well, good evening from my side in Singapore. A very big thank you to all of you for being here. So thank you to the organizers, the Faculty of Law at the University of Sao Paulo, and the Brazilian Center for Studies in Law and Religion, and especially to Professor Marcio and Professor Rodrigo for their generous invitation to give this lecture. Now, I'm told this fourth international seminar on law and religion focuses on the role of religious organizations in the public sphere and a consideration of what are the legal and principled limits of this. I think that the broad theme, which focuses on law, religion, and political cultural environment, is highly apt in the current environment that we find ourselves in. Oftentimes, when we discuss any law and religion matters, it's impossible to sever the intersection of law and religion from the political cultural context. But what this also means is that although we can point to some universal principles that we can agree on, such as the right to religious freedom, the right to non-discrimination, different contexts, different religious demography, different history of interreligious relations, as well as the presence of cross-cutting divides, would mean that solutions and constitutional settlements for each jurisdiction will have to take seriously the local context. And so while we can learn from the historical experiences and constitutional settlements in other jurisdictions, it bears emphasizing that we have to also critically interrogate these underlying assumptions, especially when theoretical frameworks and dominant paradigms are presented as if they are universal and universalizable. We have to find solutions from within our context, but at the same time, be willing to learn from other experiences. So on this basis, I think it is extremely relevant that we start thinking about the role of religious organizations and groups in the public sphere, which is an area that unfortunately does not receive as much attention as it should, at least because of a certain dominant paradigmatic resistance to seeing religion in its public, in terms of its public identity. Aline?
Bom, rapidamente, para não tomar muito tempo da apresentação da professora, ela disse que a intersecção entre lei e religião, né, o direito e religião e política, né, são fundamentais no aspecto público, né, do direito do direito à religião, e que é importante se levar em consideração um aspecto político, e que é importante, quando se tratar desse tema, levar em consideração o contexto local de cada lugar, eles são relevantes, e ao mesmo tempo existem paradigmas universais que podem, e que são universalizáveis, que podem ser utilizados para que a gente consiga esses paradigmas sejam bons para todos, né, para todos os lugares, e que possam ser usados de critério. Acho que é isso. Thank you, Professor. I hope I made you justice.
Thank you, Alina. So on this basis, I think we have to recognize the important role of religious organization and to see it as a component of a very public face of religions. Religious organizations in all societies play critical functions, where not only in terms of religious activities, but also in terms of filling gaps in provisions for social services, charitable works, and etc. We have religious organizations everywhere running hospitals, running childcare centers, community centers, and etc. But beyond a functional approach of studying religious organizations, we also have to understand religious organizations as providing a basis for strong social networks among its adherents, and sometimes even beyond its adherents. More importantly, and this is where some states have been quite critical, or rather wary of religious organizations, is the fact that they can act as a source of mobilization, bringing together different groups or different people to pursue shared objectives. Even more importantly, this means that religious organizations become a source of information, as well as a source of the normative and epistemic commitments of its adherents. It has significant influence over religious adherents' personal decisions, as well as their public choices. This means it could influence how religious believers decide matters concerning their own personal autonomy, including how they choose certain how they make certain medical decisions. Public choices, including voting, could also be heavily influenced by religious organizations. At times when religious organizations, the views of the religious leaders are seen as more legitimate, more authoritative, and more correct, this can pose real obstacles to compliance with general law and prevailing policies. Alina?
Bom, a respeito das funções das organizações religiosas, elas vão muito além do próprio serviço religioso. Elas também implicam, além das práticas religiosas, uma rede social, né, e que é responsável por fazer laços sociais e ela tem um poder de mobilização de grupo para que esse grupo também se organize para conseguir objetivos em comum. E que essas teias sociais das organizações religiosas vão para além das práticas religiosas, elas são importantes porque elas têm um impacto político. Então, a visão dos líderes religiosos, muitas vezes, elas são fontes de informação, elas são vistas como mais corretas do que, por exemplo, às vezes, o que a lei determina, e elas podem influenciar em uma gama de coisas, como decisões médicas, decisões de voto, e que elas são muito difíceis, porque elas são vistas como mais corretas, de se fazer cumprir a lei quando a opinião desse líder religioso é contrária à opinião do que a lei diz. Ok, professor.
And I would also emphasize that it is probably not surprising that some religious organizations have a grassroots reach that even exceeds that of governments in power. Many of these religious organizations predate the modern state and exist in countries globally across the world. And for instance, the Catholic Church, as we know, is seen as the oldest institution in the Western world that still operates today, with a history that traces back thousands of years. In comparison, some of the constitutions, for instance, the Constitution of the United States, which is the oldest written constitution in the world, still in effect, only dates back to 1788. So we must actually take religious organizations seriously because of the long history that they've had and the fact that they continue to wield sufficient and expensive influence across jurisdictions. Now, there are adverse effects of ignoring religion as organization. This is not to say that we have been ignoring religion or failed to address religion as religion. But there's a tendency sometimes to imagine that the state should engage with religion as individuals rather than religion as groups or religion as organization. A failure to do this could result in marginalization of religious societies, alienation and neglect that could result in certain blind spots, including towards practices that could be harmful to others in these societies. I have in mind, for instance, the marginalization of internal minorities, including religious dissenters, women, and children. Now, part of the criticism really arises from the fact that liberal constitutionalism has often insisted on seeing religion from a private perspective, to insist on a public-private divide where the public space belongs to the state, civil society, and so on, whereas the private space belongs to religion and other domestic, or what are considered to be domestic activities. So Gilles-Stopler, for instance, has written quite forcefully about how the liberalism's insistence on this public space, private religion divide creates a structural flaw that undermines the rights of women. This expands a feminist critique of the public-private divide, obscuring gender oppression as private. So as long as we say that something is private, it places that matter beyond the control of the state, beyond the regulation of the state, because that becomes a private space of autonomy. Another reason I think we need to take organizations seriously really comes from a recent work by Chilton and Fushtek on how constitutional rights matter. This is a very interesting book which employs empirical research to suggest that actually constitutionalizing rights does little to impede the government's efforts to repress rights. At the same time, they do admit that the results vary across different rights. And the very important insight here is how organizations actually matter. When organizations are able to bring citizens together to overcome coordination and collective action obstacles, they can be much more effective in mobilizing protection for rights. And so one can imagine, for instance, how religious organizations could be much more effective in mobilizing for rights related to religion. Alina?
Bom, acho que eu vou partir do final para o começo, porque a ideia principal estaria no final. A professora diz que as organizações religiosas elas devem ser levadas a sério, pelo primeiro slide, porque elas, se a gente for levar em consideração no período histórico, a Igreja Católica, por exemplo, é a instituição mais antiga do mundo, ela é mais antiga do que a Constituição norte-americana, segundo, e ela tem um peso histórico e cultural. Segundo, que essas organizações elas são capazes de produzir um efeito adverso. E esse efeito ele pode ser a marginalização e a negligência de grupos minoritários, e essa tratativa de que as organizações religiosas elas são assunto privado, elas são tratadas, elas são assuntos domésticos, de práticas domésticas e práticas privadas, faz com que a atuação para proteção de direitos, como por exemplo os direitos feministas, elas, como eu vou dizer, o Estado não consiga alcançar a partir do momento em que essas práticas religiosas, essas organizações religiosas são relegadas ao espaço privado. E que não podemos negligenciar que essas organizações religiosas elas têm o poder de se coordenar e se organizar muito bom. E que isso faz com que elas sejam ótimas em se organizar para fazer lobbies de direitos que seriam religiosos e que muitas vezes podem influenciar direitos de minorias, de grupos de minoria. Thank you, Professor.
So, since we've established that religious organizations do play important functions in society, are historically embedded, and can have significant impact on law and policy, it bears emphasizing that overlooking them in the public sphere would result in significant disconnect. On a practical level, it could result in a gap between policy and responsiveness to social values. Now, in the rest of this chapter, I want to ask these three questions. First, do we have a public religion problem? Okay, does the secular state have a public religion problem, thereby a religious organization problem, in terms of how the neglect in the study of religious organization is the result of a flawed commitment to this public-private divide? This makes religion, meant to be in the private domain, ungovernable and unregulatable. Secondly, this is where I'll go to the Asian perspective. I want to argue that we can draw some interesting insights from Asia, where the separatist claim between the public state and private religion has not taken hold in most parts of Asia. Religion is in fact accepted to have a public face. Religious organizations are governable and regulatable. Thirdly, I want to conclude by attempting to answer the question that was posed: what are some of the principles and limits of recognizing religious organizations as part of the public sphere? So, going on to the first question, does the secular state have a public religion problem? So, when one talks about public religion, one is all drawn to this work by Casanova about the rise of public religions in the modern world. He speaks about the repoliticization and the deprivatization of religion, focusing on Islamic fundamentalism and Catholic liberation theology. Of course, Brazil was one of his case studies here. This is a direct challenge on secularization theory, which talks about the differentiation, privatization, and decline of religion. Now, the work here is significant because the fact is that we can accept that there has been a certain level of differentiation between religion, but the question of whether this is a rise of public religion or whether it is the fact that religion has never been fully privatized and has always played a public role within states.
Bom, essa parte da apresentação, a professora coloca 3 perguntas fundamentais para a gente sumarizar. A primeira é se existe se o Estado secular ele tem um problema público de religião. Desculpem, I'm sorry. Se eles teriam um problema da religião tomar demais os espaços públicos, né? Se existe um problema público relacionado à religião. E se há algo que a gente pode aprender dos estados asiáticos, porque no contexto asiático, os líderes, as organizações religiosas são reguláveis e os líderes são bem identificados, eles são figuras públicas. E aí ela parte para a primeira questão, que é o debate entre a religião pública e privada e os desafios da teoria secular moderna. Então, diferenciação, privatização e o declínio da religião.
So I think sometimes I like to remind ourselves about how this claim that there needs to be privatization of religion is often described as a need for the guarantee of religious liberty. So in a democracy, the claim, as Richard Rorty points out here, is that we need to keep, the only way to keep a democratic political community going is if religious believers are willing to trade privatization for a guarantee of religious liberty. This, however, appears to have not worked in most places, because even when one is willing to accept some level of privatization, this level of privatization does not actually result in a decrease in the level of public influence that religious organizations could have. Now, this public-private divide, which claims a neutral public state whereby religious choices are private and are a matter of private conscience, is a significant claim. But I think where part of the criticism is that we treat, is that the law gives priority to individuals and not to organizations, that there is a failure to regard organizations as public organizations and not merely as private associations. And so the relationship between religious organizations and the secular government has therefore been regarded as problematic. This means that the secular state is limited in its regulatory scope. There is the space for dialogue, cooperation, and accommodation is highly constrained, whereby the state seeks to protect orthodoxy, religious beliefs, but fails to see, or rather value the religious practices as not merely private choices, but as obligatory group practice. So instead of seeing religious practice as merely personal preferences, then we need to see them as a form of group obligation and as a form of group practice. Alina?
Bom, existe, ela citou o Richard Rorty, que diz que vai ser impossível a gente manter uma comunidade democrática pública, a não ser que os líderes e que os crentes, os religiosos, crentes não no sentido neopentecostal, tá? No sentido de religiosos, não abram mão da sua crença pública e se resguardem aos lugares privados em nome de uma liberdade religiosa, né? E ela disse que isso não funcionou, que isso não funciona. Que a privatização dessas crenças públicas, dessas crenças religiosas, ela não resulta em queda de influência política desses líderes. E que, portanto, nós teríamos, então, um problema, e eu vou cortar bastante para não cortar mais o tempo da professora, mas que a gente deveria, né, ao invés de encarar isso como práticas religiosas que são privadas, que nós deveríamos olhar para isso como práticas grupos e organizacionais, porque essas organizações das atividades de um grupo ou de uma comunidade seriam uma fonte de influência política. Okay.
So let me give you an example from how religious organizations address the question of COVID-19. I'll draw examples comparing United States from some of our Asian jurisdictions. Now, when there is a tendency to regard religious organizations as private, measures, COVID measures, can be seen as infringing upon the private sphere. And therefore, when religious organizations oppose these COVID measures, they are seen as legitimately opposing political overreach into their sphere of influence and within their sphere of activity. And we do see this in the United States, where you've had multiple litigation opposing these COVID measures. And unfortunately, this could have contributed to the rise of to the high number of COVID deaths as well, because it undermines the rate of compliance with these COVID measures. Now, I want to sort of contrast this with, an approach where religious organizations are seen as legitimately operating within the public sphere, and where, as a result, they tended to cooperate with the COVID measures because they see the public sphere as part of their sphere of activity as well. So in Singapore, we saw that many religious organizations actually undertook voluntarily to restrict in-person gatherings and to rally society together to comply with COVID measures. In Malaysia, very interestingly, these COVID measures were imposed on mosques, and yet they were seen as acceptable because the government is seen as a religiously oriented partner. So engaging with religious organizations as legitimate actors within the public sphere, I think is necessary. It does require us to see that public religion is the norm, and that while we can claim a separation of religion and state, us requiring a certain level of autonomy, and I'll come to this a little bit at the end, but there is no way of separating religion and politics, and that is a far more realistic approach to engage with religious organizations as they are. Alina?
A professora relata dois casos em que as organizações religiosas são vistas como públicas e privadas, e no caso em que elas foram vistas como, ou elas são tratadas como privadas, que elas se opuseram a medidas contra o Covid, que isso teve sérias repercussões. Então, ela dá o caso dos Estados Unidos. E e nos casos em que as organizações religiosas eram vistas como públicas e, portanto, elas cooperavam com o Estado, com as medidas do Covid, que isso teve impactos mais positivos. E eu só vou citar o caso aqui de Singapura e tal, mas ela cita o caso da Malásia, porque o governo é visto como um parceiro religioso e, portanto, houve colaboração das mesquitas para o fechamento, etc., e que isso teve um enfrentamento do Covid mais positivo.
So moving on to Asia, as I've mentioned, in most of Asia, there is no strong claim of a separation of state and religion. And even when the constitution requires a separation of state and religion, this does not mean that there has been strong claims that religions should be regarded as strictly private and thereby outside of the scope of regulation and outside the scope of governance. So let me sort of look at what Asia means. Now, the geographical region of Asia is somewhat contested. It can go as to the north as Russia, to the south of East Timor. Some may even consider Australia to be part of Asia, and all the way to the Middle East as well. So it's a large geographical area, and so what I'm sort of presenting is not a uniform approach to how to study Asia. Law and religion in Asia, but to sort of identify some, I think, important trends across the region for your consideration. Now, one, I think, very important insight is to understand that Asia is one of the most religiously diverse regions in the world. This means both high levels of inter- and intra-religious diversity, where a significant proportion of this of the global population living under these conditions of high or very high levels of religious diversity are in Asia itself. And so, unlike certain regions where you have significant religious homogeneity, for instance, one might consider Europe to be relatively more religiously homogeneous, and maybe also in parts of Latin America. This is not the case in Asia. And in terms of how the state regards religion, even while most of these states consider themselves to be secular, they accept secularized forms of political authority. But although these can range from democracies, military dictatorships, or socialist rule, there is no constitutional settlement that addresses the kind of relationship that the European history has had with regards to a powerful church. And so if you look at what Sabah Mahmud has talked about, where religious liberty has always been deeply intertwined with the establishment of the principle of state sovereignty, territorial exchange between warring parties, and the creation of an interstate protocol for religious dissents, this remains a very European history, a very European historiography that has to be critically interrogated before it can be translated into the Asian context. And so a lot of the way in which we sort of organize religion within the Asian states has deep colonial history, where the colonizers brought legal transplantations, but the way in which they've been understood and implemented have differed across time. Alina?
Bom, brevemente, a professora ela mostrou o território asiático para dizer, olha, é um território muito grande, muito vasto, e é um território com bastante diversidade cultural, diversidade histórica, né, porque envolve desde da cultura da Rússia até a Austrália, né, considera-se parte ou não, depende do estudioso, como parte do território asiático, do pan-asiático. E que, portanto, ao contrário da Europa, em que as religiões elas são conectadas com a história, com as guerras, ela tem uma certa uniformidade cultural. que no caso da Ásia, a gente tem uma história de colonização que trouxe transplantes legais de religião. Okay.
So state entanglement with religion really is the norm, and what this also means is that there is significant state proximity to religious organizations. So we have the state directly establishing these religions through funding, as well as providing them with indirect support through endorsement and so on. Now, let me just very quickly sort of mention that the regulation of religion as a public religion varies across the jurisdictions within Asia, and this can entail imposing certain administrative requirements such as registration and financial reporting, as well as to rules that do have an impact on rights, such as when, where, and what type of religious activities. And so what this means is that as far as constitutional arrangements are concerned, religion is a legitimate subject of regulation because religion itself is seen as operating within the public sphere. So let me sort of mention sort of 4 different arrangements of how sort of state and religion are organized across Asia. We have significant number of countries where religion is constitutionally prioritized. So for instance, in Southeast and South Asia, across different religious traditions, you have countries such as Afghanistan, Brunei, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Maldives, and Pakistan, which which privileges Islam within the constitution itself. So for instance, Malaysia talks about how Islam is a religion of the federation and has become one of the most hotly contested constitutional provisions in the federal constitution. Cambodia also establishes Buddhism as the state religion. Thailand, Bhutan, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and so on, they do give priority to Buddhism. Now, this means that the state is allowed to directly fund these religious organizations, but also to directly regulate these religious organizations. The support can often serve majoritarian interests, which means that we have to maintain a constituency of the religious majority. So I support the majority religion in order to obtain votes from the religious majority, right? At the same time, it does result in the restrictions on conversion from majority religion. So in some of these countries, you can't convert out of Islam or Buddhism, or at least there are certain restrictions on how you can convert. There's also a tendency to police the boundaries of the religious majority through the imposition of administrative burdens on interfaith marriage. So for instance, in Myanmar, if you want to marry a non-Buddhist, you have to actually provide a notification of your intention and post a public announcement. So one can imagine that this could discourage some people from marrying outside of the Buddhist community. Aline, I think I'm going to sort of do a few more and then let you translate simply because time is running out.
Yes, up to.
Okay, so another sort of set of states that we do see are the self-proclaimed secular states. And yet, even though they are self-proclaimed secular, they nonetheless do regard religion in a very public way, and thereby regulate and engage with religious organizations as legitimate actors within the public sphere. So for Singapore, for instance, secularism is not strictly in the constitution, but it's actually written in other founding documents and widely accepted. This means, yet at the same time, Singapore has always had very cooperative links with religious organizations and has always funded Sharia courts or Islamic courts and an Islamic council. India has a constitution that declares itself to be a secular state, but we see close association between the state and Hinduism, whereby the state also is in charge of administering temples. So I thought I'll break it up a little bit and show you this beautiful picture of Singapore, where from the recent F1 race, why is this relevant to religion? So Singapore has one of the first night races for the Formula One, and this is the track for that race. Before the race, what happens is that religious organizations would send their religious leaders together to bless the F1 track. And this is quite a big event where they would also have media coverage and so on. So this is really an interesting picture from the performativity of religion, of religious interfaith cooperation as well. And also to sort of show that religion, public religion, can have a cooperative and socially cohesive objective as well. Now, thirdly, we have the separation in states where public religion is nonetheless regarded quite positively, although this could be contested over time. Philippines is one of the few countries in Asia that states that there is a separation of state and religion, and yet the Catholic Church retains extremely strong influence in public matters. Not only were members of the church involved in the drafting of the Constitution, Philippines remains the only country outside of the Vatican City where divorce is not legal, except for Muslims, because the Muslims are governed under a different code of law, the Code of Muslim Personal Law. The contestation between the Catholic Church and a very public organization and the state was highlighted in how the Reproductive Health Act was stalled for a very long time, and yet was finally passed. This act allows for the distribution of contraception, but remains highly limited in terms of allowing for reproductive rights. Abortion, for instance, is still illegal. So we see the public influence that the Catholic Church wields across in the Philippines, for instance, whereby they had also threatened legislators supporting the law with excommunication. Lastly, I wanted to point out that there's quite a number of socialist states within the Asian region as well. And the way in which they regard religion is also very interesting. Well, because they don't see religion, again, as purely a private matter, but as something that has public significance. So Laos, for instance, a socialist republic, talks about how the Constitution respects and protects the lawful activities of Buddhists and followers of other religion, yet at the same time provides certain level of support for Buddhist monks and novices, and requires them to participate in activities beneficial to the country and the people. Vietnam is another socialist state where the Constitution guarantees the right to freedom of religion, but there are these very strict rules about registration, about ensuring receiving public recognition, receiving state recognition, as well as strict requirements on how religion cannot be used to undermine very specifically peace, national independence, unity, and so on. Okay, so Alina, do you want to translate a little bit, and then I'll go to my concluding reflections.
Okay.
I know there was a lot. Sorry.
Yes, no, it's okay. I'm sorry about that. Well, there's a lot, but I'll try to. Bom, tem bastante conteúdo, então vou tentar sumarizar bastante. A professora, ela fala sobre a relação de como as religiões elas podem ser vistas como públicas, no sentido de estarem ou dentro de uma Constituição que secularmente afirma sua separação de Estado e Igreja, tanto quanto não estar, no caso da Ásia. Então ela dá vários exemplos em que essas intersecções entre Estado e Igreja acontecem. Em alguns casos, e vocês vão me desculpar, mas eu não consigo achar aqui especificamente, essa regulação ela acontece de forma até a religião ser financiada pelo Estado, com a condição de que seja regulada pelo Estado. né? Como no caso do Islã, do sul da Ásia, e no caso do Islã, do budismo e de religiões monoteístas, e outros casos que não está na Constituição, mas que existem em outros documentos, como no caso de Singapura. No caso da Índia, existe uma declaração de Estado secular, de separação de Estado e Igreja na Constituição, mas existe uma associação próxima entre o hinduísmo e o Estado, e aí no final ela termina com exemplos de intersecção entre religião e o socialismo. I tried my very best, Professor. I know that I lost a lot of content.
Yeah. Thank you. So just sort of to conclude with some reflections, what are these principles and limits of public religion approach? What I'll do, what I can is only sort of touch on some, I think, insights that one can draw from the Asian perspective. So as a start, I think that, as you might already have guessed, I think that a approach that regards religion as purely private is highly problematic. And that what we should recognize is that religion has a very public face to it and has significant public influence. And that what we need to do is to manage the risk of public religion, manage the risk of religious organizations operating within the public sphere, rather than sort of seeking to force them into the private sphere, which really doesn't work. So some of these risks include politicization of politics, whereby religion is used to advocate certain approaches to politics, to advocate for certain political groups, which can be very problematic. Another risk is the risk of state capture by religious groups, whereby the government itself may be influenced and captured by certain religious majoritarian interests. Thirdly, religious nationalism, which is a rising concern across the world, including in Asia, which gives rise to this dynamic of exclusion of those who do not belong within these religious nationalism. And lastly, there's this risk that is often presented that if the state starts to regulate religion, if the state starts to endorse or even engage with religion, the state could become a theocratic state. These, of course, all overlap with one another. But I want to say that these are risks that can be managed and should be managed rather than to be ignored by, again, forcing a privatization course upon religious organizations. Because after all, if we think about it, just because we restrict, for instance, in some countries, the religious political parties, this could just result in the masking of religious bases for a political party. So a political party can present itself as non-religious and yet still be very much supported by certain religious groups. We see this in India, we see this in the United States. Private religion, even if religion is forced to be private, this can also result in the capturing of the state again through these backdoor means of masking the religious bases. Now, we also have seen that actually religious nationalism does not depend on state support, but it requires, I think, a certain level of freedom of activity in order for it to gain influence. Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism is a topic that scholars have started to engage with in the United States. And this doesn't necessarily depend on any sort of direct state support, but flourishes within this free market type environment in the United States. And lastly, I think we have to accept that this secular claim that every religious entanglement is bad, every religious regulation is bad, needs to be rethought, because not all forms of religious entanglement results in a theocratic state. Now, what are the principles of engagement we should be thinking through? I think that ultimately, again, this is a question of managing risks rather than avoiding them. Firstly, we've already mentioned that relative autonomy is critical. This is where I think Alfred Stepan's idea of twin tolerations, whereby one should not be, the religious organization should not have a veto power over the state, is crucial. Secondly, I think non-dominance of any one religious organization is a principle that needs to be continuously established, whereby pluralism is the norm. Normative forms of pluralism needs to be one of the guiding principles in terms of how the state engages with religious organizations. This means that where in doubt, the principle is to ensure that there are different religious organizations having the ability to function within that public sphere. And lastly, I think this is where there's a need to continuously emphasize that religious organizations should be judged on the merits of their position and not the source of their position. So this means that religious organizations need to be studied very carefully. How do they operate? What legal constraints do they respond to? How do they change and innovate? I think at this point in time, the sociology of religious organizations has evolved some really important work whereby scholars have examined the impact of external environments, employed theories of organizational ecology, and to look at what norms and perceptions drive activity and innovations. But I think that we can expand the way in which different disciplines engage with religious organizations, including from an interdisciplinary perspective. And one sort of area that I think would be very important is to think about how religious organizations would engage in the digital age, where if religion becomes more and more digital, how religious organizations innovate, how religious organizations maintain their influence in the public sphere would be critical areas of research. And at the same time, there will be a need to also analyze, provide some network analysis of how religious organizations engage with one another. So all in all, I think there are significance of that this is a highly productive area of research, a highly relevant point of contention in order for us. And so I will sum up by saying that the study of religious organizations in the public sphere is both relevant, necessary, and timely. I want to congratulate the organizers for selecting such an important topic and inviting us to have an honest, critical look at the role that these organizations actually do play in the public sphere. Thank you.
Thank you, professor. Bom, professora, eu só vou traduzir a última parte, porque eu acho importante a conclusão. Para finalizar, a professora fala que existe algumas críticas sobre tratar a religião na esfera pública, mas para sumarizar bastante, que esses riscos também eles acontecem tratando a religião no Estado como uma prática privada, que não significa necessariamente que uma relação entre Estado e Igreja, de uma forma pública, signifique um Estado teocrático, mas que a gente tem o risco contrário de se tratar as religiões na esfera privada, que isso mascare uma influência que ela acontece na prática, né? Por exemplo, o nacionalismo religioso, que pode acabar excluindo grupos que não comungam, não concordem com aqueles princípios. E, por fim, ela diz que os estudos das organizações religiosas são um tema muito relevante e que é um campo muito fértil para estudo e que ainda há muito campo para se estudar nisso. Obrigada, professor. Thank you, Professor Jacqueline.
Thank you.
I try speaking English. Thank you. We're very happy with your presence, Jacqueline. Thank you very much. Your brilliant exposition helped us a lot. We could see, for example, that we have many points in common, much more than we imagined. As you said at the beginning, it's possible to find the paradigm for the exercise of religious freedom in the world. It's really necessary to find ways to guarantee religious freedom, whether in the individual and the private spheres or in the collective and public spheres. And there are advances internationally and in many countries. But unfortunately, there are also records of an increase in violations in various parts of the world. For us, knowing the reality of the Asia is not only exciting, but also a necessary and very important interaction. The explanations about the Asian context illustrate and help us a lot. Thank you very much for focusing on the theme of the seminar and your conference with the analysis of the political, cultural environment, especially in Asian countries. We are very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bom, nós agradecemos muitíssimo a professora Jacqueline pela sua exposição. Muito clara, muito... claro que na tradução muita coisa não pode ser passada, mas acho que a maioria compreendeu os contextos da Ásia. Ela especificou, ela conhece muitíssimo, obviamente, cada um dos países expostos, a sua peculiaridade em termos de religião, e como a Aline afirmou, e ela também ao longo da palestra, há uma ênfase na necessidade de trazer isso para o debate público, para o reconhecimento público, porque a religião não é somente uma experiência privada, e isso pode inclusive mascarar, na relação com o Estado, né, pode mascarar outros desvios. Agradecemos muitíssimo essas considerações, que nos foram muito claras. Se eu cometi algum equívoco, Aline, de pronúncia, você, por favor, transmita. Tentei, o inglês não é tão bom, sobretudo em termos de pronúncia, mas agradeço muitíssimo aquilo que pude compreender. Bom, a compreensão foi perfeita da minha parte, de todos os elementos que ela expôs, e fico muito satisfeito mesmo com a presença dela, e porque conhecer a experiência asiática para nós é muito, muito rico, muito enriquecedor. Quer traduzir alguma coisa do que eu falei?
Professor Márcio is apologizing for his pronunciation, but I think that he went well, excellent to read it. And he's thanking for the presentation, because he says that the Asian experience in particular is very enriching, which I agree, because I'm passionate for Asia as well. Não é isso, professor.
Thank you. Agora nós podemos passar para as questões. Eu acho que tentaram traduzir as questões, veja se está claro. Temos duas questões, mas uma, ela expõe que as pessoas acabam projetando no ambiente religioso as suas próprias...
Professor, eu acho que o senhor travou. I think that Professor Márcio is having a technical issue because he's frozen. Well, I think that we can proceed to the questions, and then Professor Márcio comes back and does his comments about it. We do have two. the first one is, are there religion... Professor, o senhor voltou?
Voltei. Eu não sei o que aconteceu, porque aqui a internet é excelente, mas não sei o que se passou. Pode
então,
falar.
por favor. Não, eu estava lendo as perguntas para ela, para a gente não perder muito tempo.
Por favor.
Bom, the first question is, are the solutions to our problems in religion? For what reason do we prefer to project on religion? The need for education with a complexity by the wise Edgar Morin is urgent. Bom,
é a projeção dos nossos problemas na esfera religiosa, né?
Uhum. Well,
that's a big question. I mean, obviously there are some philosophers, for instance, I think Dworkin, who also thinks that maybe we should not address religion as religion and just address it as, you know, beliefs, right? And that, you know, and that religion can be addressed as just another form of expression, just as another form of belief and another form of association. Now, I think that is part of where the liberal critique lies, which is, I think, secularization theory, thinking about modernization as bringing about secularization, that is also sort of reflected in the decline of religion, is basically still a theory. And that in many parts of the world, religion remains a very significant public influencer, if you like. Religion is the first influencer, right? And it remains a very relevant identity marker for people. So I think, you know, there is a crucial need to engage with religion as religion as organization, and not just religion as individual preferences. And, you know, part of this critique is about how if we maintain that we should just ignore religion, then what will happen is religion is not going to go away. It will just become stronger. And it will have a significant space to flourish in a manner that outside of the critique of the public eye. And I think that would be highly undesirable, because we've seen how this has led to the rise of religious nationalism. US, India, Myanmar, some of these places. And religious nationalism doesn't come from the state, but it comes from this private space that religion operates in to present a very specific idea of the nation as being identified with a single religion. And I think, you know, while many philosophers have, you know, argued that this is just a question of conscience, that we should, you know, regard religion as just another form of association, belief, that unfortunately is not the reality, and that is not how the how should I put it, the public space has played out in reality.
Gostaria que eu traduzisse, professor? O senhor acha que não tem necessidade?
É importante, por favor.
Bom, ela responde que a religião, ela está aí há muitos anos, ela é um importante marcador social, que ela traz identidade e que ela não vai embora, as religiões não vão desaparecer tão cedo, elas só estão se tornando mais fortes. Então, a questão, na realidade, não seria se elas são a solução ou não para os nossos problemas, mas quais os campos que nós temos para fazer com que esse crescimento dessa religião, que é algo que vai acontecer, seja mais saudável, não seria questão, mas seria melhor regulado. Isso.
Shall I answer the next question?
Pode fazer a segunda pergunta, Aline, por favor.
I will enunciate and then just to be recorded.
Okay.
How can we maintain respect and the right of expression among religious cultures, be they public or private, in such a polarized world?
Great question. If I have a magic solution to that question, I think I'll be very rich. But I think we cannot leave it to chance, unfortunately. And I think that to assert that religion should remain in the private sphere and that they somehow will remain in this happy sort of space that they're given in the private sphere and they will all live happily ever after together, is unfortunately not how things have played out. So I think it's important to ask ourselves this question continuously: how to maintain respect and the right of freedom of expression among religious cultures, but also to recognize that unfortunately, I would say our experience in Asia has been a certain degree of state regulation is necessary. So, but of course, many of these Asian states have been criticized for regulating religion. So I'll give you some examples. In many Asian states, especially those within the common law world and with a British colonial past, the penal code, the criminal code, actually contains certain provisions that makes it an offense to insult another person's religion. It also makes it an offense to speak in a manner that threatens religious harmony or racial harmony, because race and religion is often very much intertwined in this area, in this region. So regulation, to some extent, is necessary. I think this idea that we see we inherit from that some countries inherit from the American experience, where it's sort of this free market approach to religion, oftentimes does not work, especially in highly religiously diverse and religiously divided societies, because if we leave it to the free market, it can result in significant religious violence as well. So again, this does not mean that regulation is always good, but that there are certain limits to regulation. For instance, to the extent that regulation exists, certain sort of limits, such as proportionality, could be imposed to ensure that the regulations, the imposition on rights, are done in a manner that is least restrictive to the violation of those rights. So again, I think that it is an important question that needs to be addressed continuously. But unfortunately, I also think that some level of regulation is necessary in order to ensure that there is a certain level of mutual respect among different religious groups.
Bom, a professora disse que se ela tivesse, primeiro ela começa com uma piada, dizendo que se ela tivesse a resposta para isso, que ela seria muito rica, mas que basicamente ela acredita que a regulação seria um caminho. Regulação ela é necessária em até alguma extensão, que ela nem sempre ela é positiva. Alguns estados asiáticos de tradução de common law foram colonizados pela Inglaterra, em que essa regulação ela acontece dentro da esfera criminal, etc., que a regulação nem sempre é boa, mas que ela é um caminho para equalizar o ambiente público, a liberdade religiosa, enfim, e a liberdade religiosa. É isso.
Bom, seria interessante, Aline, dizer a ela que esse vídeo segue no YouTube, que no começo são poucas visualizações, depois amplia muito. Então, que esse vídeo segue, se quiserem, podemos passar para ela, tá bem?
Professor Marcio is saying that this video is going to remain on the faculty channel at YouTube. And for now, there are few visualizations, but we believe that with time it's going to grow, and it's going to be recorded there. And if you would prefer, if you want to, we can send you the recording of the video as well.
Okay. I reiterate my thanks to Jacqueline. I also thank Aline Lemos for the translations, its efforts. It's not easy technical and public translation as she did. I'm very grateful to the computer digital support, especially to the Victor and to Adrienne for the mediation between the digital platforms and all the secretarial staff. And also to Professor Rodrigo for the significant support. I thank all the participants. The conference and seminar are closed. Eu reitero meus agradecimentos à professora Jaqueline e também à Aline Lemos pelos esforços de tradução, pela boa tradução. Não é fácil uma tradução pública imediata nesse momento. Eu estou muito agradecido também ao pessoal do apoio da informática, especialmente ao Vitor, que nos acompanhou todo o evento. A Adriane hoje pela mediação entre as plataformas digitais e a todo o pessoal da secretaria que colaborou conosco nesses dias. E ao professor Rodrigo pelos contatos, pelo suporte e a todos os conferencistas. Foi um evento muito bonito e muito rico para todos nós. Eu agradeço a todos os participantes e com isso nós concluímos o nosso evento. Muito obrigado a todos e um bom dia. Good morning, good night to Jacqueline. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marcio. Bye. Thank you,
Bye.
Aline. Bye.